The music was a river of gold, pouring from the grand ballroom of the Astor Hotel and spilling into the cool October night. It was the sound of the new age, frantic, glittering pulse of jazz that promised endless champagne and forgotten sorrows. Inside, beneath crystal chandeliers that dripped light like frozen diamonds, the city's elite swirled in a kaleidoscope of silk, beads, and black-tailed tuxedos. It was a masquerade, a night where identities could be shed as easily as a coat, and for that, Beatrice Fairchild was grateful. Her own mask, a delicate creation of silver filigree and swan feathers, felt less like a costume and more like a shield. It hid the faint tremor in her hands and the anxiety that coiled in her stomach like a cold serpent. Her family's name still unlocked doors like this one, but it was a key forged from memory, not gold. The Fairchild fortune, once a titan of industry, was now a hollowed-out shell, propped up by desperate loans and the increasingly fragile optimism of her father, Cecil. Tonight, they were playing a part, performing wealth they no longer possessed, and Beatrice felt the strain in every practiced smile and polite nod. Her dress, a sheath of pale blue silk that was her mother's last gift, felt a decade old amidst the daring, knee-length creations of the flappers. They moved with a brazen freedom she could only envy, their shingled hair catching the light as they laughed, their cigarette holders held at jaunty angles. Beatrice felt like a ghost from a bygone era, haunting the edges of a party that was too loud, too bright, too relentlessly cheerful for the dread that was her constant companion. Excusing herself from a vapid conversation about the stock market, she sought refuge behind a heavy velvet curtain that separated the main hall from a quieter, oak-paneled library. The roar of the saxophone and the thumping bass faded to a distant heartbeat. She leaned her head against the cool wood, closing her eyes for just a moment, willing the world to stop spinning. That was when she heard the voices. One was her father's, strained and pleading. The other was a low, cold baritone that slid over the ear like polished steel. Beatrice froze, her hand flying to her throat. She knew that second voice. Walter Vance. He was a man who had built an empire on ruins, buying out struggling companies, squeezing them dry, and discarding the husks. His name was whispered in fear in the very circles that now courted his favor. Her father had spoken of him with a forced reverence, calling him a necessary associate. "Walter, I just need more time," Cecil Fairchild pleaded, his voice thin with desperation. "The shipping contracts will come through. It's only a matter of weeks. Time is the one commodity I do not trade in, Cecil." Vance's voice was devoid of all warmth. A glass clinked against a table. "You've had 6 months. The notes are due. Your collateral is insufficient. I'll find it. I swear on my life." A dry, mirthless chuckle echoed in the small space. "Your life is of no value to me. But you do possess an asset of considerable worth, an untouched asset." A chilling silence followed. Beatrice held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel the meaning of his words before they were even spoken, a vile insinuation that made her skin crawl. "What are you suggesting?" her father asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Your daughter," Vance stated, the name hanging in the air like a death sentence. "Beatrice, a lovely girl, so well-bred, so pure, a jewel to adorn any man's home. A marriage contract would be a suitable arrangement. It would wipe the slate clean. It would, in fact, bind our families in a most profitable union." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. The air in her lungs turned to ice. He wasn't talking about a courtship, a romance. He was talking about a transaction, a purchase. She was the collateral. Her body, her future, her very self, being bartered away like a piece of property to settle a debt. Nausea rose in her throat, hot and acidic. "Never," her father choked out, but his protest lacked conviction. It was the weak defiance of a trapped animal. "She's my only child. I could not." "You could, and you will." Vance's voice hardened, shedding its thin veneer of civility. "Or you will lose everything. The house, the name, what little reputation you have left. You will be ruined, Cecil. Utterly and completely. I will see you in the gutter. Think of your daughter then. A destitute orphan. What future would she have? I am offering her a gilded cage, my friend. A far better alternative to the streets." The calculated cruelty of his words struck Beatrice with the force of a physical blow. He had thought it all through, had laid the trap with meticulous care. Her father's silence was the most damning response of all. He was considering it. He was weighing his ruin against hers. Unable to hear any more, Beatrice stumbled back, pushing through the velvet curtain. The ballroom assaulted her senses. The once golden music now sounded like a mocking shriek. The laughing, dancing figures seemed like grotesque caricatures, their masks hiding predatory smiles. The air, thick with perfume and cigar smoke, was suffocating. She had to get out. She pushed her way through the oblivious crowd, murmuring apologies as she bumped into shoulders and jostled champagne flutes. She didn't stop until she found the French doors leading out onto the terrace. She wrenched one open and stumbled into the cold night air, gulping it down as if she had been drowning. The terrace overlooked a manicured garden, a labyrinth of sculpted hedges and stone benches cloaked in shadow. The noise of the party receded behind her, muffled by the heavy glass. Here the only sound was the distant hum of city traffic and the rustle of autumn leaves. She tore the mask from her face, her breath coming in ragged sobs. The feathers tickled her tear-streaked cheeks. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. A gilded cage is still a cage. The voice came from the deepest shadows near the balustrade. It was a low, resonant murmur, nothing like the slick coldness of Walter Vance's tone. This voice held a different kind of danger, a quiet, controlled power that vibrated in the air. Beatrice spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A man emerged from the darkness, the ember of his cigarette glowing like a single watchful eye. He was tall, dressed in an impeccably tailored tuxedo, but he wore no mask. He didn't need one. His face was a mask in itself, full sharp angles and unreadable planes, with eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the dim light. He moved with a liquid grace that was at odds with his formidable frame, a predator at rest. I beg your pardon," she stammered, clutching her mask to her chest like a shield. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, his gaze never leaving her face. He wasn't looking at her the way other men did, with appreciative or lecherous glances. He was studying her, his expression intense, analytical. It was unnerving. "Vance has a fondness for pretty things he can lock away," the man said, his voice flat. He exhaled a plume of smoke that swirled and vanished into the night. "He tires of them quickly." Beatrice stared at him, her fear warring with a desperate curiosity. How much had he heard? Who was he? He didn't look like one of the vapid stockbrokers or aging industrialists inside. There was a coiled stillness about him, a hint of street-forged steel beneath the fine wool of his suit. His hands were large, and she noticed the faint, silvery trace of a scar across his knuckles as he raised the cigarette to his lips again. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He took a step closer, and she instinctively took a step back, her bare back pressing against the cold stone of the balustrade. He stopped, respecting the distance. "Don't you?" he asked softly. It wasn't a challenge, but a simple statement of fact. "Your eyes tell a different story, Miss Fairchild." He knew her name. A fresh wave of panic washed over her. Was he an associate of Vance's? Another vulture circling her family's impending demise? "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking but laced with a sliver of defiance. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth, a fleeting expression that did not reach his dark eyes. Someone who believes a woman's honor isn't something to be settled on a ledger. He looked past her, back toward the shimmering lights and frantic energy of the ballroom. This world, it's a beautiful lie, but the truth always collects its debts in the end. He took one last drag from his cigarette and flicked it over the balustrade. The ember spun through the darkness, a falling star, before extinguishing in the damp grass below. Without another word, he gave her a slight, almost formal nod, and melted back into the shadows from which he had come, leaving Beatrice alone with the echo of his words. She stood there for a long time, trembling, not just from the cold, but from the encounter. He hadn't offered comfort or a solution, only a stark, chilling observation. Yet in his dark eyes, she had not seen the predatory ownership that defined Walter Vance. She had seen something else, something far more complex and dangerous: recognition. He had looked at her not as a prize to be won or an asset to be claimed, but as a fellow soul trapped on the wrong side of a beautiful lie. Return into the ballroom was impossible. The thought of facing her father, of seeing Walter Vance, made her feel physically ill. She remained on the terrace, the cold seeping into her bones, watching the dancers whirl behind the glass. They were oblivious, lost in their gilded world, but Beatrice was no longer one of them. She was standing in the shadows, where the truth was spoken in whispers, and where men with scars on their hands made cryptic pronouncements in the dark. The night was no longer about champagne and jazz. It was about survival, and she was caught between two powerful, dangerous men, with no idea which one she should fear more. The drive home in the family's Ford Model T was a journey through a silent, suffocating fog. The celebratory roar of the city faded behind them, replaced by the rhythmic, almost mournful chug of the engine. Beatrice sat beside her father, her posture ramrod straight, the pale blue silk of her dress feeling thin and useless against the creeping chill. Cecil kept his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white mountains on a pale, trembling landscape. The air between them was thick with the things they would not say, poisoned by the conversation Beatrice was never meant to hear. She watched the gas lamps blur past the window, each one a fleeting beacon in the oppressive dark, a gilded cage. The words echoed in her mind, a mocking refrain. Walter Vance hadn't just made a proposition, he had passed a sentence, and her father's silence, his complete and utter inability to meet her gaze, was his guilty plea. He had considered it. In the face of his own ruin, he had held his only daughter's future in his hands and weighed it on a scale against his pride. And he had hesitated. That hesitation was a betrayal sharper than any blade. When they finally arrived at the Fairchild residence, a stately brownstone that had once been the envy of the neighborhood, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a mausoleum. The grandeur was still there, the marble entryway, the sweeping mahogany staircase, but a film of neglect had begun to settle over everything. The brass needed polishing, a faint scent of dust hung in the air, and the silence within its walls was heavy and profound. The days that followed were an exercise in quiet terror. The pressure from Walter Vance was not overt. It was a slow, methodical strangulation. A telegram arrived the next morning, its clipped, impersonal message announcing that the bank, a firm Vance, had recently acquired a controlling interest in, was calling in a significant loan. The deadline was 1 week. Sesson's face, already pale, turned the color of ash as he read it. Then came the social chill. An invitation to a charity luncheon was politely rescinded due to an unforeseen scheduling conflict. At their local market, Mrs. Albright, a woman who had known Beatrice since she was a child, offered only a curt nod before turning her back. The whispers followed them like a second shadow, the scent of financial ruin, as potent and repellent as sickness. Vance was isolating them, cutting them off from the herd before moving in for the kill. He sent flowers. 24 blood-red roses arrived in a crystal vase that was surely worth more than the Fairchild's remaining silver. The card contained only 5 words, written in a sharp, arrogant script, anticipating our future arrangement. W.V. Beatrice felt a wave of revulsion so strong she nearly retched. She took the vase herself and carried it to the back alley and smashed it against the brick wall, watching the perfect roses shatter amidst the glittering shards of glass. It was a small, futile act of rebellion that left her hands shaking and her heart pounding with helpless fury. Her father retreated into a shell of whiskey and despair. He spent his days locked in his study, the sound of his frantic, useless telephone calls echoing through the house. He was trying to liquidate assets that no one would buy, calling on friends who no longer answered. Beatrice would hear his raised voice, cracking with desperation, followed by the heavy thud of the receiver being slammed back into its cradle. Each failed call was another nail in their collective coffin. On the 5th day, the house was unnervingly quiet. The maid had been let go that morning, her tearful departure a stark symbol of their final decline. Beatrice was dusting the parlor, the familiar, mundane task, a small anchor in a sea of chaos, when the doorbell rang. Its chime echoed through the silent house like a funeral bell. Her father didn't stir from his study. With a sigh, Beatrice smoothed her simple day dress and went to answer it. Standing on her doorstep was the man from the terrace. He was even more imposing in the harsh light of day. He wore a dark grey 3-piece suit, impeccably tailored, and a grey fedora that he removed with a fluid motion as she opened the door. His dark eyes, just as intense and unreadable as she remembered, swept over her, taking in her plain dress and the smudge of dust on her cheek. There was no flicker of judgment, only that same unnerving, analytical appraisal. "Miss Fairchild," he said. His voice was the same low murmur, but in the quiet of the entryway, it carried the weight of authority. "My name is Arthur. May I have a word with your father?" Beatrice was momentarily speechless. Of all the people she might have expected, a creditor, a bailiff, even Walter Vance himself, it was not this enigmatic stranger. "My father is indisposed," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur's gaze did not waver. "I believe he will want to see me." He didn't raise his voice, yet the statement was an undeniable command. It brooked no argument. Hesitantly, she led him to the study. She knocked softly on the heavy oak door. "Father, there is a gentleman here to see you, a Mr. Arthur." A muffled, irritable groan came from within. "Tell him I'm not here. Tell him I'm dead." Arthur stepped past Beatrice, his presence seeming to fill the narrow hallway. He didn't bother to knock. He simply opened the door and walked inside. Beatrice, propelled by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, followed him to the doorway. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and spilled whiskey. Cecil Fairchild sat slumped behind his large desk, a half-empty bottle at his elbow, surrounded by a chaotic blizzard of papers. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused, as Arthur entered. "Who the devil are you?" Cecil slurred, attempting to draw himself up with some semblance of dignity. Arthur ignored the question. He walked to the desk, his movements calm and deliberate, and moved a stack of unpaid bills aside to place his hat down. "Walter Vance gave you a week, Mr. Fairchild," he stated, his voice cutting through the haze of alcohol. "You have 2 days left. Your credit is gone. Your friends have abandoned you. You have nothing left to sell and nowhere left to turn." Cecil stared at him, his mouth agape. How do you know that?" "It is my business to know," Arthur said simply. He looked from the pathetic figure of her father to Beatrice, who still lingered in the doorway. His eyes held hers for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, she felt as if he could see every fear she had, every secret shame. "Vance will not stop," Arthur continued, his attention returning to Cecil. "When the deadline passes, he will take this house. He will destroy your name, and then he will come for your daughter. Not with a marriage proposal, not anymore. He will take her as payment, and the law will look the other way, because you will be a man with no power and no influence." The brutal, unvarnished truth of it hung in the air, more suffocating than the smoke. Her father seemed to shrink in his chair, the last of his fight draining out of him. "What do you want?" Cecil whispered, his voice trembling. "Are you with him?" "I am against him," Arthur corrected, his tone turning to ice. "And I am here to make you a proposal." He paused, letting the silence stretch, commanding the room with his stillness. Beatrice found she couldn't breathe. "I will settle every one of your debts," Arthur said, his voice low and even. "The bank, your private lenders, every last cent. I will restore the Fairchild credit line. I will ensure Walter Vance and his associates never come near you or your family again. I will give you back your life." A flicker of desperate, disbelieving hope ignited in Cecil's eyes. "For what? What is your price?" Arthur turned his head slightly, and his dark gaze fell fully upon Beatrice. It was not a look of desire or even affection. It was a look of finality, of acquisition. "My price," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that filled the entire room, "is your daughter's hand in marriage." The world tilted on its axis. Beatrice gripped the doorframe for support, her knuckles white. It was the same offer, the same transaction. A gilded cage for a gilded cage. Was there no man in this city who saw as anything more than a commodity? A choked, hysterical laugh almost escaped her lips. "You see, father," she said, her voice shaking with a cold, terrible rage. "It seems I am the only asset the Fairchild family has left." Cecil looked from Arthur to his daughter, his expression one of utter confusion and defeat. He was a pawn in a game he didn't even understand. Beatrice pushed herself away from the doorframe and stepped fully into the room, her chin held high. She would not be bartered for in a doorway like a piece of livestock. She faced Arthur directly, her fear warring with a sudden blazing defiance. "Why?" she demanded, her voice clearer now, stronger. "Why would you do this? You don't know me. You don't know my family. What could you possibly gain from this arrangement?" Arthur regarded her for a long moment. He seemed to appreciate her fight, the way she stood up to him when her own father had crumbled. "Let's call it a business acquisition," he replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. "I am acquiring an asset to deny it to a rival. Vance wants you, therefore I will have you. His loss is my gain. It is as simple as that. Simple." He spoke of her life, her future, her body, as if it were a parcel of land or a shipment of illegal whiskey. Yet his cold logic was somehow less terrifying than Vance's leering possessiveness. Arthur didn't speak of her beauty or her purity. He spoke of her as a strategic piece on a board. There was no pretense of affection, no veneer of courtship. It was a raw, honest transaction. She looked at her father, a broken man drowning in his own weakness. He could not protect her. He would have sold her to Vance to save himself. Arthur, for all his coldness and menace, was offering protection. He was offering to stand between her family and the abyss. The price was herself. It was a choice between a predator who wished to devour her and one who offered a shield, no matter how cold and heavy it might be. It was a choice between two prisons. But in one, she would be owned by a monster. In the other, she would be protected by one. Beatrice took a deep breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. She met Arthur's dark, unyielding gaze. "I accept your proposal," she said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. "On one condition, A flicker of surprise, of something akin to respect, crossed Arthur's face. "Name it. My father's safety is guaranteed, forever," she stated. "This is not just about the money. You will shield him from Vance, and from any consequences of his own foolishness. He is to be left in peace." Arthur considered her for a moment, then gave a single decisive nod. "You have my word. The house of Fairchild will be under my protection." He picked up his hat from the desk. "I will have my lawyer draw up the papers. The wedding will be tomorrow." Tomorrow. The word fell like a guillotine. There would be no engagement, no courtship, no time to even comprehend the magnitude of her decision. She had just sold her life, and the contract was due immediately. He walked towards the door, pausing as he passed her. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the faint, clean scent of starch and something else, something uniquely his, like cold night air, and expensive tobacco. "Do not mistake this for a romance, Miss Fairchild," he murmured, his voice for her ears alone. "This is a vow of silence, a contract. You will be my wife in name, and in return, you will be safe. That is all." And then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the hall, leaving Beatrice in the ruins of her father's study, bound by an irrefusable proposal and chained to a man she knew only as a shadow. The wedding was a transaction conducted in the sterile, sun-bleached chambers of a downtown magistrate. There were no flowers, no music, only the monotonous drone of a city official reading words that were meant to bind two souls, but felt, to Beatrice, like the final, damning clauses of a contract. She wore a simple, cream-colored dress, a last-minute purchase that felt more like a shroud than a bridal gown. Her father stood beside her, a shrunken, hollowed-out version of the man he once was. His presence, a constant, painful reminder of the sacrifice being made. Arthur stood on her other side, a figure of immutable calm. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit, and his expression was as placid and unreadable as a deep lake at midnight. When the moment came to say, "I do," Beatrice's voice was a thread of sound, barely audible. Arthur's, in contrast, was clear and firm, the confident declaration of a man closing a deal. He slid a simple, unadorned platinum band onto her finger. It felt impossibly heavy, a cold, solid shackle that anchored her to this new, terrifying reality. There were no congratulations, only the scratching of a pen on a certificate and a curt nod from the magistrate. Within 15 minutes, Beatrice Fairchild ceased to exist. In her place stood Mrs. Arthur, a woman with a new name and no future of her own. The journey to her new home was made in a gleaming black Packard, a motorcar so quiet and powerful it seemed to glide through the city streets rather than drive. Arthur handled the wheel with the same effortless control he seemed to apply to everything. He did not speak, and Beatrice, wrapped in a cocoon of numb disbelief, stared out the window. The familiar brownstones and bustling storefronts of her old life blurred past, looking like scenery from a world to which she no longer belonged. They arrived at one of the city's newest and most luxurious apartment buildings, a towering monument of limestone and ambition that scraped the sky. A uniformed doorman rushed to open the car door, his deference to Arthur bordering on fear. They rode a gilded elevator in silence, the ascent so swift and smooth it made Beatrice's stomach lurch. The doors opened directly into the penthouse suite, and she stepped out into a space that took her breath away. It was less a home and more a cathedral of modern wealth. The main room was a vast expanse of polished black marble floors and towering, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying panorama of the entire city, from the bustling harbor to the distant flicker of lights in the boroughs. The furniture was sleek, geometric Art Deco, all sharp lines and expensive materials, lacquered wood, chrome, and rich velvet in shades of charcoal and silver. It was stunningly beautiful, impeccably curated, and utterly devoid of warmth or personality. It felt like a showroom, a place designed to impress, not to be lived in. It was the most magnificent cage she had ever seen. "Your home," Arthur said, the first words he had spoken since the ceremony. It was a statement of fact, not a welcome. A severe-looking woman, in a crisp grey uniform, appeared as if from nowhere. "Mrs. Gable will see to your things," Arthur continued, gesturing towards the woman. "She is the housekeeper. She will show you to your room. Your room, not our room." A small, shameful wave of relief washed over Beatrice, so potent it almost made her knees buckle. She had been steeling herself for what a wedding night might entail, what duties her new, purchased status as a wife would demand of her. The thought had been a source of cold, persistent dread. Mrs. Gable gave a stiff, formal nod. "This way, madame." Beatrice followed the housekeeper down a long, silent hallway. Her own room was as luxurious and impersonal as the rest of the apartment. A large bed was covered in a silver silk spread. A vanity table stood bare except for a crystal perfume bottle, and a set of doors opened onto a private balcony with a view of the river. Another door led to a walk-in closet, already filled with clothes she had never seen before: shimmering beaded dresses, elegant day suits, silk stockings, and rows of pristine shoes. Everything was in her size. The discovery sent a fresh chill down her spine. He had prepared for her arrival with the meticulousness of an acquisitions manager stocking a new property. She was just another beautiful, expensive object to furnish his cold, empty home. When she returned to the main room, Arthur was standing by the window, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He turned as she approached. "There are some rules," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "You will want for nothing. My accounts are at your disposal. You may come and go as you please, but Mrs. Gable will arrange for a driver. You will not walk the streets alone." He took a sip from his glass. "You will be discreet. My business is private. You will not ask questions about my work, my associates, or where I go at night. In public, you are Mrs. Arthur, a devoted wife. In this house, we are acquaintances. Is that understood?" "Perfectly," Beatrice replied, her voice tight. "You have purchased my name and my presence. You have not purchased my curiosity." For the first time, a flicker of something amusement, surprise, danced in his dark eyes. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Good," he said. He finished his drink in one smooth motion and set the glass down on a chrome table with a soft click. "I have business to attend to. I will be back late." And with that, he was gone, leaving her alone in the cavernous, silent penthouse, the city lights beginning to glitter below like a carpet of scattered jewels. The silence was the first thing that began to wear on her. It was a living entity in that apartment, broken only by the distant wail of a ship's horn or the hushed, efficient movements of Mrs. Gable. The days bled into one another, each one a copy of the last. Beatrice would wake in her silk-sheeted bed, eat a breakfast she had not ordered, served on china she had not chosen, and then face a vast expanse of empty hours. She tried to read, but the words swam before her eyes. She tried to play the grand piano that stood in the corner of the living room, but the notes sounded hollow and joyless in the sterile space. She began to see the fragments of his other life, the world he inhabited when he left the penthouse. Sometimes, late at night, men would arrive. They were not his society friends. They were hard-faced individuals with watchful eyes, dressed in suits that never seemed to sit quite right on their broad shoulders. They would disappear with Arthur into his private study, the heavy door closing with a definitive thud. Beatrice would catch snippets of their low voices, but never the words themselves. They carried the scent of the docks, of cheap cigars, and something else, the metallic tongue of danger. One evening, Arthur returned long after midnight. She had been unable to sleep and was sitting in the darkened living room, watching the city below. He didn't see her at first. He walked to the bar, his movements weary. As he shrugged off his overcoat, the faint, sweet, and malty smell of whiskey reached her, not the refined scent of the Scotch in his decanter, but the raw, potent aroma of a distillery. It clung to the wool of his coat like a second skin. It was the smell of prohibition, the scent of a secret, illegal empire. He finally noticed her, a pale figure in the shadows. He froze for an instant, his guard raised. "You should be asleep," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "This is my home now, is it not?" She countered, a bitterness she couldn't contain lacing her words. "Am I not allowed to sit in it?" He didn't answer. He simply poured himself a drink and stood across the vast room, the space between them a chasm of unspoken truths. She could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. For a fleeting moment, he looked not like a powerful gangster or a cold businessman, but just a tired man. The thought was so alien, so unwelcome, she pushed it away. He was her jailer, her captor. He deserved no sympathy. Her resentment grew, a poisonous vine twisting around her heart. She resented him for his cold control, for the gilded bars of her cage. She resented her father for his weakness, for forcing her into this position. Most of all, she resented herself for the thread of fear that was her constant companion, fear of Arthur, fear of what he did in the shadows, and fear of the men who moved silently through her new life. This marriage was not just a vow of silence. It was a sentence of silence, an indefinite term to be served in a beautiful prison high above a city that was no longer hers. For 2 weeks, the silence of the penthouse was Beatrice's only companion. Then, one evening, as the sky outside the vast windows bled from bruised purple into inky black, Arthur appeared in the doorway of her room. She was sitting by the window, a book lying unopened in her lap, watching the city's lights ignite. He had changed from his usual severe business suit into a perfectly cut tuxedo. "We're going out," he said. It was not a question. Beatrice looked up, startled. "Ow. Where?" "You've been a prisoner in this tower long enough," he stated, his expression unreadable. "It is time the city saw Mrs. Arthur on her husband's arm. Wear the green dress." He left without waiting for a reply. Her heart began to beat a nervous, frantic rhythm. She went to the closet and found the dress he meant. It was a shimmering column of emerald green beads and silk, daringly sleeveless, with a hemline that would have scandalized her mother. It clung to her form in a way that was both elegant and provocative. As she slipped it on, looking at her reflection in the full-length mirror, she felt a strange duality. She was dressing for her keeper, adorning herself as he commanded, yet a spark of defiant excitement flickered within her. After weeks of listless silence, anything felt better than the suffocating stillness of her cage. The drive was short, taking them into a part of the city known for its theaters and less reputable establishments. The Packard slid to a halt, not in front of a grand hotel or an opulent restaurant, but before a modest, unassuming florist shop. The windows were dark, the door locked. A burly man in an oversized coat, who had been leaning against the wall, straightened at their approach and gave Arthur a curt nod. He unlocked the door and held it open for them, leading them not into a shop filled with flowers, but down a narrow, dimly lit hallway. At the end of the hall was a thick, soundproof door. The man knocked 3 times, paused, then twice more. A small slit slid open, revealing a pair of watchful eyes. A moment later, the door swung inward, and the world exploded in a riot of sound and life. The air hit her first, a thick, warm wave of perfume, illegal gin, and cigarette smoke. And then the music, a living, breathing entity that filled every corner of the vast subterranean room. A 7-piece band was on a small stage, the brass of the saxophone and trumpets gleaming under the low, smoky lights. The jazz they played was hot and wild, a syncopated, joyful rebellion against the sober laws of the world above. The room was packed with people flappers in glittering dresses, dancing with men in sharp suits, their laughter mixing with the clinking of glasses and the wail of a clarinet. It was a speakeasy, the kind of place she had only read about in scandalous newspaper articles. It was illegal, dangerous, and more vibrantly alive than anywhere she had ever been. As she stood there, momentarily overwhelmed, she felt Arthur's hand on the small of her back. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was one of guidance, of ownership. But the warmth of his touch through the thin silk of her dress was a startling, undeniable shock. He steered her through the crowd, and a strange thing happened. The chaotic sea of people parted for them. Men stopped their conversations to nod respectfully. Women watched them with a mixture of curiosity and deference. Here, in this hidden, lawless kingdom, Arthur was not just a man, he was the king. A waiter led them to a secluded booth in the back, raised slightly above the main floor. From this vantage point, they could see the entire room. Arthur ordered them drinks, whiskey for him, a champagne cocktail for her without asking. "Welcome to the Gilded Lily," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the music. "It's yours," she stated. It wasn't a question. A faint smile touched his lips. "One of my more legitimate businesses." For the first time, she saw a different side of him. The cold, calculating businessman and the silent, menacing gangster were replaced by a man completely at ease, a master of his domain. He watched the room with a look of quiet satisfaction, his body relaxed, his fingers tapping out a silent rhythm on the table in time with the music. She saw the way his bouncer subtly scanned the room, the way the bartender never let his glass go empty, the way the bandleader caught his eye and gave a slight nod. This was his world, built of secrets and whispers, powered by illegal liquor and the relentless, liberating pulse of jazz. And for some reason he had chosen to show it to her. When the band shifted to a slower, bluesier tune, a saxophone crying a long, soulful melody, Arthur stood and extended his hand. "Dance with me." Beatrice hesitated. The thought of being in his arms, held against him in the center of this swirling, illicit world, was both terrifying and strangely tempting. But to refuse was not an option. She placed her hand in his, and he led her to the small, crowded dance floor. He pulled her closer than she expected. One hand held hers, the other rested firmly on her back, his fingers splayed against her bare skin. Her own hand came to rest tentatively on his shoulder, and she could feel the hard muscle beneath the fine wool of his jacket. He moved with a surprising grace, a fluid, confident rhythm that was at odds with his formidable presence. He was a paradox, a man of brutal power who could move with the elegance of a dancer. They didn't speak. The music was the only language between them. Trapped in his orbit, Beatrice was forced to follow his lead, to move where he moved, to sway to the rhythm he dictated. She kept her eyes fixed on the knot of his tie, unable to meet his gaze. But she could feel his eyes on her, an intense, burning scrutiny that seemed to see right through the emerald dress, through her carefully constructed walls of resentment and fear. The air between them was charged, electric with unspoken things. For a few intoxicating minutes, she wasn't a prisoner. She was simply a woman, dancing with a dangerous man in the heart of the Roaring Twenties. The spell was broken by a familiar, grating voice. "Well, well, if it isn't the happy couple." Beatrice stiffened in Arthur's arms. He stopped moving, his entire body going still and cold. Over his shoulder she saw Walter Vance approaching them, a predatory smirk on his face. He was flanked by two thuggish-looking men. The festive atmosphere around them seemed to curdle. "I must say, Arthur, I'm surprised," Vance said, his eyes raking over Beatrice with insulting familiarity. "I always knew she'd look beautiful on the arm of a powerful man. I just imagined he'd be a gentleman." He took a step closer, his gaze fixed on Beatrice. "But then, second-hand goods are often a bargain, aren't they?" The insults, so public, so vile, hung in the air like poison. Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face, a wave of hot shame washing over her. She felt Arthur's hand tighten on her back, a subtle, restraining pressure. Arthur didn't raise his voice. When he spoke, his tone was lethally calm, a blade of ice in the warm, smoky room. "You are in my club, Walter. You're speaking to my wife. You have 10 seconds to apologize to her before I have you removed." Vance laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Your wife? Don't make me laugh. She's a payment on a debt. We both know what she is." He reached out as if to touch Beatrice's arm. "Come now, little songbird, don't." He never finished the sentence. Arthur moved with a speed that was almost invisible. He didn't throw a punch. He simply shifted his weight, releasing Beatrice and stepping in front of her, his body a solid shield. He caught Vance's outstretched wrist in his hand. The motion was so fluid, so silent, it was barely perceptible. But the result was not. A sharp, cracking sound echoed in the sudden hush, and Walter Vance's face went white with agony. A choked gasp escaped his lips. "I believe," Arthur said, his voice a deadly whisper that only those closest could hear. "The word you were looking for was sorry." He applied more pressure, and Vance's knees buckled. "Sorry," Vance hissed through clenched teeth, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and terror. Arthur held the grip for a moment longer, his dark eyes boring into Vance's. Then he released him with a contemptuous shove. Vance stumbled back into his men, clutching his wrist, his face a mask of humiliation and raw hatred. "Get out," Arthur said, his voice returning to a normal volume, yet carrying the unmistakable weight of a death sentence. Without another word, Walter Vance and his men turned and practically fled, swallowed by the crowd that parted for them as if they were lepers. The band, after a moment's hesitation, struck up a frantic, loud tune, a desperate attempt to stitch the torn fabric of the night back together. But for Beatrice, the party was over. Her body was trembling uncontrollably. She had just witnessed the violence she had always suspected lay beneath Arthur's calm exterior. It was swift, precise, and utterly terrifying. Arthur turned back to her. His face was a calm, impenetrable mask once more, as if nothing had happened. "Let's go," he said, his tone flat. He took her by the elbow and led her from the dance floor, out the secret door, and back into the cold, sober reality of the street. The drive back to the penthouse was steeped in a thick, ringing silence. Beatrice stared at her own reflection in the dark window, seeing a pale, wide-eyed stranger in a glittering green dress. He had terrified her. He had acted like a brutal thug, but he had done it to defend her honor. He had shielded her from the man who would have owned her, humiliated her, and broken her. The monster she had married had stood between her and a far more loathsome beast. As they stepped out of the elevator into the silent apartment, she felt more confused than ever. Fear and resentment still warred within her, but a new, deeply unsettling emotion was beginning to take root. A strange, reluctant gratitude. Her cage was still a cage, but tonight, for the first time, she had been forced to acknowledge that its bars were also a shield. The aftermath of the speakeasy incident settled into the penthouse like a fine, invisible dust, coating every surface with a new and complex tension. The air, once merely silent, was now charged with the memory of that swift, brutal violence. Beatrice found she could not look at Arthur's hands. The hands that had held her so firmly on the dance floor. The hands that had snapped Walter Vance's wrist with such terrifying ease without a tremor of fear. Yet woven into that fear was a confusing thread of something else. He had called her his wife. He had defended her. The words and the action were a shield, and she was the one cowering, ungratefully, behind it. Arthur seemed to retreat even further into himself. He was a ghost in his own home, leaving before she woke, and returning long after she had retired to her room. Their only interactions were curt nods in a hallway, or the sound of his study door closing with quiet finality. The distance between them, once a simple physical reality of a large apartment, now felt like a vast, unbridgeable chasm. 3 days after the incident at the Gilded Lily, he was gone entirely. Mrs. Gable informed her, in her usual clipped tones, that Mr. Arthur had been called away on business to Chicago, and would be gone for the remainder of the week. The news left Beatrice with a hollow feeling that was equal parts relief and a strange, unsettling emptiness. The cage was now entirely hers, and she found the absolute freedom within its walls to be more suffocating than his presence. Restlessness drove her from her room. She wandered the silent, sunlit apartment like a spectre, trailing her fingers over the cool, lacquered surfaces, staring at the impassive, geometric art on the walls. She was a curator in a museum where she was the sole captive exhibit. Her wandering eventually led her to the one place she had never entered, his study. The door was, for the first time, slightly ajar. Hesitantly, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was the heart of his empire, and it felt like it. It was a deeply masculine space, paneled in dark mahogany and smelling of old leather, expensive tobacco, and ink. Bookshelves lined one wall from floor to ceiling, filled not with novels, but with heavy tomes on law, economics, and engineering. A large globe stood in one corner, and a detailed map of the city's shipping lanes was pinned to a corkboard. Unlike her father's chaotic study, this room was a fortress of order. Everything was meticulously arranged, from the pens aligned perfectly in a silver cup to the neat stacks of ledgers on his massive desk. It was the desk that drew her. It was the throne from which he commanded his secret world. A half-smoked cigar lay in a heavy crystal ashtray, the only sign of recent occupancy. She ran a hand over the polished wood, feeling a strange intimacy in this small act of trespass. Her eyes fell upon a thick, leather-bound volume of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. It seemed an odd choice for a man like him. Compelled by a sudden impulse, she lifted the heavy cover. Tucked between the pages was not a bookmark, but a single, folded piece of stationery, yellowed with age. The paper was thin, almost brittle, and the handwriting was a delicate, feminine script, faded but still legible. It was a script she recognized instantly, a cursive she had tried to emulate her entire childhood. Her heart stopped. It was her mother's handwriting. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the letter. Her breath caught in her throat. "Dearest Mr. Arthur," the letter began, "I pray this letter finds you well. I must write to express my deepest, most sincere gratitude for your actions yesterday. When my motorcar failed on that dreadful stretch of road near the docks, I was quite beside myself. To have a young man of your character not only assist a stranger, but to then stand up to those ruffians who meant to take advantage of the situation, well, it has restored a measure of my faith in the goodness of this city. You refused any monetary reward, a testament to an honor that is rare and precious. My husband and I are forever in your debt. I only hope that my own daughter, Beatrice, will one day be fortunate enough to know men of such strong moral fiber. You are a true gentleman, in spirit, if not in station, and I shall never forget your kindness. Yours in sincere gratitude, Evelyn Fairchild Beatrice read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through the sudden film of tears in her eyes. The date at the top was from over a decade ago. She remembered the incident vaguely, her mother coming home late, flustered but unharmed, speaking of a flat tire and the kindness of a young dock worker who had helped her. She had been a boy, a poor boy from the docks, and he had protected her mother. She sank into the leather chair behind a desk, the letter clutched in her hand. The foundations of her world tilted violently. The man she knew, the cold, ruthless gangster, the man who had bought her like property, was the same boy her mother had praised for his honor. He had kept this letter for more than 10 years, hidden away in a book of philosophy. Why? The image of him standing between her and Walter Vance flashed in her mind. It was the same action, a decade apart. A different woman, a different circumstance, but the same instinct, to shield, to protect. The cold, calculated business acquisition he had described to her felt, suddenly, profoundly, like a lie. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in a maelstrom of confusion. She was still holding the letter when she heard the sound of the elevator, followed by footsteps in the main hall. He was back, a day early. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and walked out of the study, the letter held in front of her like a talisman. He was in the entryway, shrugging off his overcoat. He looked tired, lines of exhaustion etched around his dark eyes. He saw her, and his expression, already weary, hardened slightly at the sight of the yellowed paper in her hand. He knew instantly what it was. "You were in my study," he said, his voice flat, devoid of accusation, but heavy with something else, resignation. "My mother called you a gentleman," Beatrice said, her voice shaking. "She said you had honor. She prayed I would one day know a man like you." She took a step closer, her eyes searching his, desperate for an answer that made sense. Was this it? Was this whole arrangement because of a flat tire 10 years ago? Did you buy me to repay a debt to a dead woman? Arthur turned away, walking over to the bar to pour himself a whiskey. His back was to her, a solid, unbreachable wall. "It's more complicated than that. Explain it to me," she insisted, her voice rising with a desperate edge. "You owe me that. After everything, you owe me the truth." He took a long swallow of his drink, then turned to face her. The weariness in his eyes was profound. "Your mother," he began, his voice low and rough. "She was the first person of consequence who ever looked at me and saw a man, not just a piece of street filth. She showed me kindness, respect. No one had ever done that." He walked to the window, staring out at the sprawling city below. "I was nothing then, a kid fighting for scraps on the docks, but I made a promise to myself that day, that her kindness would not be forgotten, that if I ever had the power, the Fairchild family would never want for anything." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "I spent the next 10 years building that power. Irony is a cruel mistress." He turned back to her, his gaze intense. "When I heard your father was in debt to a man like Vance, when I heard what Vance was planning, it was a desecration of her memory. He was going to use you to ruin the family she loved, to tarnish the name she held so dear. Letting that happen felt like failing to repay the only real debt I ever had." So it was true. This entire loveless, silent marriage, this gilded cage, was his twisted way of honoring a decade-old promise. He hadn't bought her to spite a rival. He had bought her to protect her, to fulfill a secret vow he'd made to her mother's memory. He wasn't her jailer. He was her self-appointed guardian, a knight in dark, blood-stained armor. The revelation left her breathless. The anger and resentment that had been her constant companions for weeks seemed to dissolve, leaving a raw, aching vulnerability in their place. The monster had a heart, however hidden and scarred it might be. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, the question fragile in the silent room. "Would you have believed me?" He countered softly. "Or would you have thought it was another lie, another form of manipulation? It was better to be the villain. It was simpler. He had chosen to let her hate him, to cast himself as a cold-hearted tyrant, rather than reveal a past that hinted at vulnerability, at a youthful idealism he had long since buried. He had protected her from Vance, and he had tried to protect himself from her, hiding his true motives behind a mask of ruthless pragmatism. She looked from the letter in her hand to the man standing before her. He was still a stranger, a dangerous man who lived by a code she couldn't begin to understand. But he was no longer a monster. He was a man bound by a silent, powerful sense of honor, a man who had orchestrated her entire life to repay a single moment of forgotten kindness. The silence that fell between them was different now. It was no longer empty or hostile. It was filled with the weight of his secret, with the ghost of her mother, and with the staggering, terrifying realization that she had misjudged him completely. She was still a prisoner in his home, but she was beginning to understand that he might be just as trapped by his own vows as she was by hers. The fragile truce born from the letter's revelation was a delicate, tentative thing. It did not fill the penthouse with warmth, but it did drain it of its poison. The silence between Beatrice and Arthur was no longer a weapon, but a space of cautious observation. She found herself watching him, searching for glimpses of the boy her mother had met, the honorable young man hidden beneath the hardened gangster. He, in turn, seemed to observe her with a new, guarded curiosity, as if seeing her for the first time as something other than a living monument to a dead woman's kindness. But the world outside their silent tower was not a place of quiet reflection. It was a place of bruised egos and festering hatred. Walter Vance was not a man to suffer humiliation lightly. To be broken and dismissed in front of his own kind was a wound that would not heal. It could only be cauterized by revenge. The first sign that the storm was about to break came in the form of a telegram. It was addressed not to Arthur, but to Beatrice. 3 stark, terrifying lines. Your father has had an accident. Come to the old Red Hook warehouse 12. Come alone. Beatrice's blood ran cold. It wasn't a message, it was a lure. Her father, for all his weakness, was the one piece on the board she had insisted be protected. Vance knew this. He was striking not at Arthur's empire, but at the heart of his promise. She crumpled the paper in her fist, her first instinct a wave of pure, unadulterated panic. Arthur was in his study. She burst in without knocking, her face ashen, and held out the decrumpled telegram. He took it, his eyes scanning the words, his face hardening into a mask of granite. The weariness she had seen in him before vanished, replaced by a cold, lethal focus. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." He was already moving, striding towards a heavy steel safe concealed behind a bookshelf. He spun the dial with practiced speed, pulling it open to reveal not money or ledgers, but a holstered handgun and several spare clips of ammunition. "No," Beatrice said, her voice trembling but firm. "You can't go alone. It's a trap. He wants you, not my father. That's why I'm going alone," he said without looking at her, checking the mechanism of the gun with a swift, efficient movement. He tucked the weapon into a shoulder holster beneath his suit jacket. "This is my world, Beatrice. My fight. You are to remain here, where you are safe." He turned to leave, but she moved to block his path, her hands pressed against the heavy oak door. "And what if you don't come back?" she cried, the words torn from a place of fear she hadn't known existed. "What becomes of him? What becomes of me? I will not sit here and wait like a prize to be claimed by the victor." His dark eyes locked onto hers, and for a split second, she saw a flicker of something raw and unguarded, a flash of anger, of fear, of a desperate need to keep her shielded from the ugliness of his life. "This is not a discussion," he growled. "You will do as I say." He moved her aside, his touch firm but not rough, and was gone. The sound of the elevator descending, a final metallic groan. For a moment Beatrice stood paralyzed, her mind screaming at her to obey, to lock the door and hide. He was the protector. She was the protected. That was the contract. But the woman who had meekly accepted her fate weeks ago was gone. She had been replaced by someone who had danced with the monster, who had seen his hidden honor, and who could not, would not, let him walk into a trap for her sake. The vow of silence was broken. She would not be a passive piece in his game any longer. Her decision was a spark of pure, unthinking instinct. She ran to the hallway telephone, her hands shaking as she dialed the number for the Gilded Lily. A gruff voice answered. "This is Mrs. Arthur," she said, her voice gaining strength with every word. "Get me Stanley, now." Stanley was Arthur's head of security, a mountain of a man with a cauliflower ear and surprisingly intelligent eyes. He was on the line in seconds. "Ma'am? Walter Vance has my father. He's luring Arthur to Warehouse 12 in Red Hook." "It's a trap," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Arthur went alone. You have to go. You have to help him." There was a moment of silence, then a string of curses on the other end of the line. "We're on our way, Mrs. Arthur. Don't you worry." But she was worried. She couldn't just wait. The image of Arthur facing Vance and his thugs alone was a horrifying reel, playing over and over in her mind. She grabbed her coat, her purse, and ran from the apartment, hailing the first taxi she saw on the street. "Red Hook," she told the bewildered driver, "and hurry." The warehouse district was a desolate, forgotten corner of the city, a maze of crumbling brick buildings and rotting piers that smelled of salt, decay, and stagnant water. A thick fog rolled in from the harbor, muffling all sound and cloaking the world in a shroud of gray. Warehouse 12 was a hulking, dark shape at the end of a deserted cobblestone street. Beatrice paid the driver and slipped out of the cab, her heart hammering against her ribs as she crept towards the building, sticking to the deepest shadows. Through a grimy, broken window, she could see inside. The vast, cavernous space was lit by a few bare, dangling bulbs, casting long, distorted shadows. In the center, her father was tied to a chair, looking terrified and small. Walter Vance stood over him, a cruel smile on his face, flanked by at least half a dozen of his brutish men. Then, the main loading door creaked open, and Arthur stepped inside. He stood alone in the entryway, a solitary figure against the swirling fog, his hands empty and held slightly away from his sides. He looked calm, impossibly calm, but Beatrice could see the coiled tension in his shoulders. "I'm here, Walter," Arthur's voice echoed in the cavernous space. "Let him go. This is between us." Vance laughed, the sound ugly and triumphant. "Oh, it is. But I wanted him to have a front row seat, to see his daughter's protector get torn apart." He gestured, and his men began to spread out, circling Arthur like a pack of wolves. "You took everything from me, Arthur. My reputation, my asset." His eyes were burning with a mad hatred. "Tonight, I collect the debt." Arthur's gaze swept the room, assessing, calculating. He was outnumbered, badly. Beatrice's blood ran cold. He had walked into this knowing the odds, prepared to die to keep his promise. As Vance's men began to close in, a sudden, piercing noise shattered the tension. It was the blare of a car horn, followed by the screech of tires as two black sedans, their headlights cutting through the fog, roared down the street and screeched to a halt outside the warehouse. Stanley and Arthur's men, armed with shotguns and Tommy guns, spilled out, taking up positions by the doors and windows. Vance spun around, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. The trap had been turned. For a moment, there was a stunned, silent standoff. It was the opening Arthur needed. He moved with the blinding speed she had seen once before, but this time it was not a single, precise strike. It was a whirlwind of brutal efficiency. He disarmed the man closest to him, using the man's own body as a shield as he drew his pistol. 2 shots rang out, deafening in the enclosed space, and 2 of Vance's thugs crumpled to the ground, clutching their legs. But, in the chaos, Vance saw his own opportunity. While all eyes were on the fight, he pulled a small, silver pistol from his coat pocket and pointed it not at Arthur, but at Beatrice's father. "Nobody moves," Vance screamed, his voice cracking with desperation, "or the old man dies." Everything stopped. Arthur froze, his gun still raised. Stanley's men held their positions. Vance had the final card. Beatrice watched from the broken window, her mind racing. They were at a stalemate. Any move from Arthur's side would mean her father's death. She was hidden, unseen, a ghost in the fog. Refusing to be a victim, she scanned her surroundings. Beside her, stacked against the wall, was a pile of old wooden crates and a rusted iron pry bar. An idea, born of sheer adrenaline-fueled desperation, took hold. She grabbed the heavy pry bar. It was cold and impossibly heavy, with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She heaved it upwards and smashed it against the already cracked window pane. The sound of shattering glass was like a gunshot in the tense silence. For a split second, every head inside, including Vance's, snapped towards the noise. It was all the distraction Arthur needed. He didn't hesitate. He didn't fire his gun. In 2 long strides, he closed the distance between himself and Vance, striking the man's wrist with the side of his pistol. The silver gun clattered to the concrete floor. Arthur grabbed Vance by the front of his coat, slamming him back against a pillar with a sickening thud. The fight was over. Arthur held Vance pinned, his forearm pressed against the man's throat, his face a storm of controlled fury. His gun was now pressed to Vance's temple. For a long, terrifying moment, Beatrice thought he was going to kill him. She saw the war in his eyes, the darkness of his world urging him to end this threat forever, to pull the trigger and silence Vance's poison for good. But then his gaze flickered past Vance, towards the chair where her father sat, and then somehow he seemed to look right through the wall, right at the spot where she was hiding. He was facing a choice, not between victory and defeat, but between his past and a possible future. He could kill Vance and remain the king of the shadows, a man ruled by violence and vengeance, or he could spare him, an act of mercy that felt like a risk, a step towards a different kind of life, a life with her. His hand trembled, the barrel of the gun pressed hard against Vance's skin. The longest night of their lives hung suspended in that single, terrible moment of decision. The air in the warehouse was thick with the metallic scent of fear and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Time seemed to stretch, pulling taut around the silent tableau. Arthur, his face a mask of cold fury, pressing the gun to Walter Vance's temple. Vance, gasping for air, his eyes wide with the primal terror of a man staring into his own grave, and Beatrice, a phantom in the fog, holding her breath, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw the war in Arthur's eyes, a battle between the darkness that had forged him and a sliver of light he had only just begun to acknowledge. Then, with a slow, deliberate exhale, the tension in his shoulders eased. He did not pull the trigger. He lowered the gun. "Get him out of my city," Arthur said, his voice low and serrated, directed at Stanley, who was now standing beside him. "Make sure he has nothing but the clothes on his back. If I ever see his face again, if I even hear his name whispered on the wind, I will find him, and I will finish this. Do you understand?" Vance, now a deflated, pathetic figure, could only manage a terrified nod. Stanley and another man hauled him to his feet and dragged him out into the night, a king dethroned and banished from his own kingdom. The remaining thugs, seeing their leader broken, surrendered without a fight. Arthur watched them go, his posture rigid, his breathing still controlled. He then turned and walked to Cecil Fairchild, pulling a knife from his pocket and cleanly slicing through the ropes that bound him. "You're safe now, Mr. Fairchild," he said, his tone devoid of warmth but carrying the finality of a promise fulfilled. Cecil, trembling and incoherent, could only stammer his thanks. Stanley approached Arthur. The girl was outside, boss. She made the call. She broke the window. He spoke in a hushed, respectful tone. "She saved you." Arthur's gaze immediately shot towards the broken window. He walked towards it, his steps measured, and peered out into the foggy darkness. Beatrice stepped out of the shadows, the rusted pry bar still clutched in her hand like a strange medieval weapon. Their eyes met across the grimy expanse. The chasm that had separated them for weeks, a gulf of secrets, fear, and misunderstanding, seemed to vanish in that single, shared look. He had seen her not just as an asset to be protected, but as a partner who had fought alongside him. And she saw him, not as a monster or a jailer, but as a man who had chosen mercy over vengeance for a future she was a part of. He said nothing, only gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod, but it was enough. It was an acknowledgement, a concession, a surrender. The ride back to the penthouse was different from all the others. Cecil, wrapped in a blanket and given a stiff drink, was dropped at his brownstone, where Stanley's men would stand guard until the morning. Then it was just Arthur and Beatrice, gliding through the deserted, pre-dawn streets in the quiet sanctuary of the Packard. The city was washed in the pale grey light that comes just before the sun, a time of peace and stillness. When the elevator doors opened into the penthouse, the first rays of dawn were beginning to slice through the towering windows, painting the black marble floors in strokes of gold and rose. The cold, sterile apartment looked, for the first time, warm. Beatrice turned to face him in the entryway. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a heart that felt too large for her chest. "You didn't kill him," she whispered, the words hanging in the still air. "No," he said, his voice quiet, rough with the night's events. He finally looked at her, truly looked at her, and the mask was gone. His dark eyes were stripped of their usual defenses, revealing a vulnerability she had never seen. "A decade ago, I promised myself I would build an empire to protect your mother's memory, but empires built on fear and violence, they have no room for light." He took a step closer, his gaze searching her face. "Tonight, I realized I don't want to be a king in the darkness anymore. I want to build something that can stand in the sun." This was his confession, the admission that the life he had so meticulously constructed was no longer enough, that she, the girl he had bought to honor a debt, had become something more. She had become the reason to want a different life. "Arthur," she began, her voice thick with emotion, but she didn't know what to say. "Thank you. I was wrong. I love you." The words felt too small for the magnitude of what had passed between them. He closed the remaining distance, stopping just before her. He slowly, almost hesitantly, reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently brushing away a smudge of dirt she hadn't realized was there. His touch was not possessive or controlling. It was tentative, questioning, a silent request for permission. "Beatrice," he said, her name a soft murmur, the first time he had spoken it with anything resembling tenderness. "The contract is fulfilled, the debt is paid, your father is safe, you are free to go." He offered her an escape from the gilded cage, the one thing she had once craved more than anything. But as she looked up into his tired, searching eyes, she realized the truth. The penthouse was no longer a prison. It was the only place she wanted to be. The man before her was no longer her captor. He was her anchor, her shield, her unexpected home. "This was never about a contract," she said softly, her hand rising to cover his. "Not for either of us." She leaned into his touch, a gesture of complete and utter surrender to the truth of her own heart. "I'm not going anywhere." A slow, genuine smile transformed his face, chasing away the last of the shadows. It was a revelation, a sight more breathtaking than the sunrise over the city. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or demand, but one of profound, soul-deep relief. It was the closing of one chapter and the gentle, hopeful first line of another. Their marriage had been born of a gangster's vow and an innocent's desperation. It had been forged in silence, tested by violence, and nearly broken by secrets. But here, in the quiet light of a new day, it was finally being reborn, not as a contract, but as a choice, a partnership, a sanctuary built not on a foundation of lies, but on the enduring strength of honor, sacrifice, and the love that had bloomed, impossibly, in the darkest of shadows. The silent vow had been broken, replaced by the promise of a new and beautiful chord, a melody they would now compose together. True honor is not found in wealth or power, but in the silent vows we make to protect the innocent. Love can bloom in the most unexpected of circumstances, proving that the strongest sanctuary is not a fortress of stone and steel, but one built from sacrifice, trust, and a shared heart. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more romances.